Andrew Seidel. We've known him for quite a while, almost since we started the Central Florida Freethought community. Andrew has been a name that we've been talking about and meeting with, and I consider myself so lucky to have gotten to see his meteoric rise and become the Instagram sensation that he is today. If you haven't seen him on Instagram, I encourage it. So Andrew is a constitutional attorney, an author, as I think all of you are aware, and the Vice President of Strategic Communications at Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, an organization who partnered with the CFFC, if you didn't know this, in our second successful lawsuit in Brevard County. Andrew graduated cum laude from Tulane University with a BS in Neuroscience and Environmental Science, and magna cum laude from Tulane Law School, where he was awarded the Harper McCarthy Award for Excellence in Environmental Law. Look where he is today. He studied human rights and international law at the University of Amsterdam and traveled the world on a semester at sea. Andrew completed his Master of Law at Denver University Sturm College of Law with a perfect GPA and was awarded Outstanding LLM Award. His first book, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American, was published in 2019. He was here with us on that book tour before, and he returns this year to talk about his new book, The American Crusade, How the Supreme Court is Weaponizing Religious Freedom. Andrew, welcome back to the Central Florida.
There are a limited supply available for sale back there, and they are limited, so, you know, just saying. I don't know how many we sold already, but... Actually, before I dive in, no, I'll do it afterwards. I want to say a few things about CFFC, though, because this is an amazing organization. I have seen its meteoric rise. I travel around the country a lot having these discussions. I've talked to local groups, certainly in every region, if not every state, and CFFC is among, if not the top, and that is because of David and Jocelyn. If you're not supporting them with monthly donations through PayPal of $10 or more, I would really encourage you to do that. I'll pitch some other things too. Groups like this are so important in the fight that we face right now, but pause that for a moment. Universal freedom or Christian privilege. Protection or weapon. That's one of the fights that we face today. Religious freedom has long been a shield. It has been that protection for the minority against the tyranny of the majority. It has defended all of us, from atheists to evangelicals, Muslims to Mormons, Buddhists to Baptists, and everybody in between. Never in our history has it been a license to hurt other people, to discriminate, or to violate their rights. But this packed Supreme Court, collaborating with a very well-funded network of Christian nationalist organizations, I'm going to call them crusaders, is changing the very meaning of this constitutional right. They are deliberately warping, perverting the religious freedom that we understand as a constitutional protection. The Bible tells us, didn't expect that here, did you? About beating swords into plowshares. They are doing the exact opposite. This packed course, in case after case, these crusaders are taking that universal freedom and they are beating it into a weapon of Christian supremacy. A weapon that conservative Christians, right, the right kind of conservative Christian, can wield to impose their religion on all of us, to violate our rights. They are reforging the protection of religious freedom for all into that weapon for the privileged few. And each case that this court is deciding in the religious freedom arena, in the state church arena, is strengthening that weapon. Now, the Crusaders are the legal groups that are in this billion-dollar shadow network that we are facing. They are groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, which we'll be arguing at the court tomorrow, Liberty Council, First Liberty Institute, the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty. You know, it's kind of this Orwellian word salad. And the Crusaders set these cases up, and then the conservative justices on the court come along and knock them down. It is a collaboration, collusion, we might say. And if you've been paying attention to some of the reporting lately, you know that that's not far off. And I call this a crusade because this is a war of conquest. They're not seeking to conquer land, but they are seeking to conquer our Constitution, and they want to remake it in their image so that they can have the Christian nation that they've always sought. And in American Crusade, how the Supreme Court is weaponizing religious freedom, I tell the story of this decades-long push to create, to reforge this protection into this weapon. And I honestly believe that you cannot understand what is happening in this country right now, from our politics, to our law, to our court, to our Constitution, without understanding this crusade. It is a through line for so much of what is going on right now. So American Crusade tells the true stories of what happened in each and every one of the cases that you may have heard about. And some of them you may have heard about. They may be top of your mind, right? The gay wedding cake case is one that comes to mind for a lot of people. The Muslim ban case. The COVID church cases, right? The churches that were challenging public health measures during the pandemic. The Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe versus Wade. And then also the cases that you may not remember, but which are just as important, if not more important. The case that came down this past term, Carson versus Macon, which supposedly involved public funding for Christian schools. Really, it amounts to government-enforced tithing. The Hobby Lobby case, which a lot of people have forgotten about, unfortunately, and it's going to come back in a real way. Crosses on government land, school vouchers. I have spent the last decade in the trenches fighting these cases. I'm a lawyer. I've litigated some of them. I've briefed others. I've briefed the Supreme Court on others. At the very least, I have been working alongside the lawyers who are bringing these cases. And I really thought it was crucial to tell the true stories behind each of the cases because so much of that has been lost to history now. I wanted to draw back the curtain on this assault. So American Crusade does that. It tells you the true stories, but then it also goes through and connects each of those stories to this overarching crusade. Because too often we treat each of these cases as a one-off, as this is a thing that happened that one time before the court, but the court was just addressing that particular issue, and that is not what we are seeing. We are seeing a coordinated, thought-out assault that has been happening for decades, a crusade. So I tell you the true stories, but then I also give you those through lines. And when you read what happened in these cases, some things become very clear. One is that this Supreme Court wants to take these cases. It's desperate to take these cases. This court will ignore rules and procedure so that it can take these cases. This court will ignore precedent when the time comes to decide these cases and gut precedent if necessary. And, I don't know which one of these is most alarming, but this one is pretty darn alarming. This court will rewrite facts and reality to reverse engineer decisions in a way that privileges conservative Christians. It will change reality to get to the decisions that it wants to. So you get these through lines in American Crusade, and then you get the overarching narrative so that you can really understand what is going on. Because I think too many people just do not today. And the best part is that you get it without all the jargon. We legal professionals, we lawyers, we love to hide behind legalese and civil procedure and levels of scrutiny and precedents and all the, we love to hide behind them. We tell ourselves that we're not. But often it is much better to just cut through all of that, to shed the bullshit of our profession and get to the heart of the case, to get back to basics. So American Crusade does just that. I avoid legal jargon, I avoid case names, I avoid legal tests. I wrote this book so that everybody can understand the crusade that is happening, the threat that we face, and just how radical this Supreme Court and the decisions that it is issuing truly are. Because if we don't wake up to the threat, there's no way that we're going to be able to stop it. And I do have hope that we will stop it. It's at the end of the book, so you got to read it. Now, when you cut through all the prattle and piffle that surrounds these cases, again, a couple things become very clear. But one thing that I think is remarkably clear is this, a simple truth that shines through it. And it's that these cases, these religious freedom cases, when religion and the law collide, are actually really easy to solve. These are not hard legal questions. We can solve them by essentially writing 3 lines. And the only reason they become difficult or intractable or seem hard is because there are ulterior motives behind most of these cases. Right? Can a business, a limited liability corporation, refuse to serve a gay couple in violation of civil rights laws because the owner is a conservative Christian? What about, can we erect and maintain a 40-foot tall Christian cross on government property with taxpayer funds? Can believers ignore public health rules in the middle of a pandemic because their holy book says so? Do Christian parents have the right to use the taxing power of the government to pay for their child's private Christian education, even though we already have a public education system established that applies to everybody? And what if those schools are blatantly bigoted and discriminatory? Can the government and its officials use the power of their office to impose their personal religion on other people? Or here's one that kind of came up recently. Can one narrow religious belief be used to deny half the population basic human rights? And the answer to all these questions is very simple. These are not hard questions, and in each of these are real cases, and the answer should be no in each of those. And the Crusaders have done a remarkably great job of confusing most of us about where we draw these lines and how we draw these lines, and acting like these are difficult, and they're not. And the 3 basic lines are this. First, we distinguish between action and belief. And your right to believe anything is absolute. Your right to act on that belief is not. So I open the book with stories about Jesus taking the wheel. These are real stories. Several of them happened in Florida. You'll be shocked. Where people let Jesus take the wheel. And they get into car accidents. They hurt people. They hurt their passengers. They hurt other folks. Clearly, the government can step in and say, no, you can't do that. And if you have done that, we can punish you. We might send you to jail. We might take away your license. You might have to pay for the damage. There's no religious freedom issue there. And nobody claims that there are all these crusading groups out there. None of them have stepped in to help these people who are talking directly to Jesus and getting driving instructions. It ought to be the religious freedom question of our day if this was real. It's not. We distinguish between action and belief, and everybody understands that at a basic level. So the question is, okay, the government can step in at some point when you are acting on your belief, religiously motivated or otherwise. Well, where? So this is line number 2, and this is pretty easy as well. Your right to freely exercise your religion ends where the rights of other people begin. You've all heard that your right to swing your fist ends at the other person's nose. Same thing. Your right to swing your religion ends where the rights of other people begin. In some cases it may end sooner, but it definitely ends there. Put another way, your religion is not a license to violate anybody else's rights. Never has been, should never be. That's one of the things that's changing. And then the third line is the line between church and state. And I have to say that I think our side has done not the best job of talking about this line recently, in the last decade. We often talk about it in terms of court cases. This court case says you can't do X, Y, or Z, which I think is not great. And we really need to probably spend a lot of time thinking about how to communicate this. The government has no religion to exercise. And when a government official is acting in their official capacity and wielding their official power, they have no religion to exercise. That's why we should never have things like government prayer. And even though CFFC does this fantastic work, and I encourage you to join it with these invocations, those shouldn't be a thing because the government doesn't have the power to say a prayer. Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers said, has no particle of spiritual jurisdiction. Anyway, I lay out these lines in American Crusade, and then I tell you the true stories of the cases and then apply the lines. And it becomes very clear, you see what should have happened, and then you see what the court actually did. You see how easy it could have been for the court to get the right answer when you cut away all that nonsense, and then you get to see what actually happened. And that really lays the crusade bare. Now, one thing I want to answer here before you get into the book is why. And this is something that I really spent a lot of time on when I was writing the book. Why are they looking for this weapon? Why are they on this crusade? I think that's something that we have to understand and address in this fight. And the answer is that it is largely a backlash. The crusade is largely a backlash against equality realized. And what I mean by that is that conservative white Christian Americans' status as the dominant group, the dominant caste in our society, has been waning for a long time. And more the power and privilege and deference, which they wrongly believe they are due, has been disappearing. And we know for a fact that when that happens in a society, that dominant group reacts or overreacts in everly increasing violent ways. This is why you see them turning to things like Christian nationalism, turning to the so-called strongmen like Donald Trump, turning to a violent insurrection on January 6th, and then turning to this weaponized version of religious freedom. They are trying to reclaim and re-entrench that lost power and status and privilege, and especially the deference which they believe they are due. And there are actually plenty of studies that back this up that I get into in the book. There's a 2021 survey that found that simply mentioning the changing religious demographics in the country, right? The nuns are on the rise, N-O-N-E-S. That Christianity is declining rapidly in the country. Simply mentioning that actually triggered a political threat response in a lot of Christian nationalists and drove them more into the arms of Donald Trump. So simply acknowledging the shifting demographics created a feeling that their religious freedom was threatened. And you really have to pause to appreciate what that means, because they understand they misunderstand religious liberty as privilege. They believe that religious freedom means enjoying the trappings and status of their dominant caste, not actual religious freedom for all. And incidentally, we are in the season for that. That's what the War of Christmas is all about. And seriously, right? Like, they are upset that they are no longer the culturally dominant group. That's what the War of Christmas is. It's not a war on them. It's all of a sudden we are being more equal and inclusive, and they don't like that because it takes away from their power and privilege and dominant status. So, the expansion of equality and the withering of their religious and racial hegemony is the contested territory in many of these religious freedom cases that are covered in American Crusade. Put another way, conservative white Christian America is dying a slow demographic death, and it is rebelling. They are raging against the dying of their privilege. And so they declared war. And that is the crusade. And this is a full-on onslaught by a rich and powerful network. All of the cases are connected. The justices on the Supreme Court are connected to the cases. And I really do think American Crusade is probably not like any other book that you've read. There are plenty of pop law books out there, but I don't think a lot of them draw the connections the way this book does. It shows, again, that the justices are eager and ready to take these cases, that they want to take these cases, right? The Supreme Court rejects somewhere between 97 and 99% of the cases that come its way, but it accepts pretty much every religious freedom case that comes its way. And it decides them in favor of Christians. The simple fact is that this Supreme Court wants to take these cases. The conservative, this is such a truism now, the conservative justices on the Supreme Court are not impartial justices, carefully working to determine the meaning of a constitutional provision and without bias, and then arrive at the appropriate decision. Right? If the Crusaders didn't pack the court is already packed. They didn't pack the court to put impartial justices on the bench, to put impartial jurists up there. If all they wanted were impartial jurists, they wouldn't have spent all that time and money and political capital blocking Merrick Garland. If all they wanted were impartial justices, they wouldn't have rammed Amy Coney Barrett onto the court after 60 million people had voted. They wouldn't have made the Supreme Court election issue if they wanted impartial jurists. I mean, this is, I think, the hardest truth for a lot of Americans, especially lawyers, people who have been fighting this for a long time, is that the ultra-conservative justices on our Supreme Court are crusaders too. And I get into that in the book. Leonard Leo, some of you probably know that name by now, is universally recognized as the guy who orchestrated the hostile takeover of the Supreme Court. He ran the Federalist Society for a long time, ran the Judicial Crisis Network, and a former employee described his mission regarding the courts like this. Leo, quote, figured out 20 years ago that conservatives had lost the culture war. Abortion, gay rights, contraception, conservatives didn't have a chance if public opinion prevailed. So they needed to stack the courts. And they did. And notice that the anti-democratic goal inherent in that quote, right? If we don't pack the courts, democracy will work. If we don't pack the courts, public opinion will prevail. They are trying to subvert democracy by capturing the judiciary. And Leo spent $540 million. That's $500 million. $540 million packing the court from 2014 to 2020. And this summer, his new group got a donation of $1.6 billion. That's 1.6 billion with a B from a single donor. That's $1 billion more than he spent packing the courts for his new endeavor, which is more anti-democratic, if you can believe it. So you learn about Leo in this book, and there's already an update for American Crusade available for free to everybody who's purchased the book on my website. You'll learn more about that donation, and you'll learn exactly what Leo was looking for in the judges that he was working to get on the bench. So here is how his job was described regarding the judiciary. He was described as, quote, the monitor of the nominee's ideological purity. Okay? All told, we know that Leo is responsible for the confirmation of Roberts, that's Chief Justice John Roberts, Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett. That's 5. That's 5 justices. He and Clarence Thomas are old friends. There's actually video of them joking together on stage at a Federalist Society event in Texas about how Leo is the 3rd most powerful man in America. They think it's hilarious. And I know this is hard, but all 6 of those people are or were members of the Federalist Society, and they were selected for their ideology, for their ideological purity, for their commitment to this crusade. They have a crusader ideology. And I want to address Roberts in particular, because I know a lot of people think, well, he's maybe more of a moderate nowadays. I read the book. John Roberts worked in the first Bush department alongside Ken Starr. He wrote briefs arguing that public schools can impose religion on children at graduation ceremonies, and that Christian Bible clubs can use public schools to organize. And while he was in the Reagan White House, he supported a constitutional amendment that would allow public schools to impose Christian prayer on school children. And in a legal memo, he wrote this, quote, "We still have a long uphill battle to return prayer to schools. We battle, return prayer to schools." That is the language of a crusader. Right? This court is packed with crusaders, and the ploy to capture the courts, and this court in particular, worked. There have actually been a couple studies crunching the numbers, and I don't have updated numbers from this last term, which was even more of a watershed term for these cases. But before the courts were packed, going back to around the 1950s, it was about what you would expect. Religion, whatever that might mean, won in front of the court a little less than half the time. That's kind of a coin flip. That's sort of random chance, what you would expect. Under Roberts, that win rate jumps to 81%. And it gets worse because it's not a pro-religion or a pro-religious freedom shift, it's a pro-Christian shift. So mainstream Christianity won about 44% of the time, and under Roberts that jumps to 85%. That basically doubles. So religious freedom has become Christian privilege. I mean, that is what we are seeing. So I tell you those stories in this book. I do not think you can understand what is happening right now without understanding these stories. And I think it's absolutely crucial that you arm yourself with the information to explain to people not only the crusade, but also the court's role in the crusade. The fact that this is, for the most part, a collaboration, collusion. And we're seeing that more and more and more. And American Crusade puts a face on those numbers on both sides, too. Because it's not just that it's favoring Christians, that the court is favoring Christians, the reverse of that is true also. Like, think of the Muslim ban case. Right? You could not get a clearer example of animus and hostility towards Muslims than Donald Trump's public statements. And you can't get the court to agree with that. Some of the recent death penalty cases are actually shocking in how much they favor Christians. Religious freedom is only for conservative Christians. That is what you are seeing at this Supreme Court. And I want to get to your questions. I know people have a lot. I can see your minds going. So I'm going to close out and give you a little bit long. At this Supreme Court, justice is no longer blind, if it ever was. The new guiding principle of this Supreme Court is not the Constitution or the law. It is simply this: Christianity wins. I don't know how else to put it. I mean, this court does not consider religious freedom as a universal freedom, but as a Christian privilege. So, Andrew, that's really depressing. Thanks for that. I do have hope. I do have hope. There are solutions to this problem. They're not hard solutions, actually. They're relatively simple. I also have hope because their wins grow our movement. Right? Their wins in the abortion case, in the case of the coach imposing prayer on other people's kids, in the case out of Maine where they're forcing taxpayers to fund bigoted Christian schools now. Their wins swell our ranks. Remember, the whole reason for this crusade in the first place is demographics, essentially. They are seeing the changing demographics, they are seeing the waning of their power and their privilege and the deference, and they are raging against it. So their wins not only grow our site, but they're also creating a feedback loop where they're driving more people into our arms. So I mean, think about it like this. White Christian nationalists are working to privilege the chosen few. Every legislative and legal victory they notch alienates more people, wakes more people up to the danger, and drives more people into our arms. Drives more people to defend the separation of church and state and true religious freedom. Drives more people into the arms of groups like Americans United for Separation of Church and State and the Central Florida Freethought community. And I'm really proud to be representing that fight on the front lines. Their power-hungry aggression is growing our movement. And I mean, we can think about it another way too, because they're crusading because we are working to meet the unmet promise in the American experiment, right? In the Declaration of Independence and in the US Constitution, the self-evident truth that all are equal, that we the people means all the people. And previous generations have absolutely failed to realize the aspirational goals in those principles, right? They've failed to contend, and they've left it to their children to solve human tragedies like slavery and segregation and the subjugation of women and discrimination against LGBTQ people and now the climate crisis. And as we continue to march toward progress, Christian nationalists are fighting ever harder against it. They're not going to go gently. They're going to rage against the dying of their privilege. But in the end, we will win, because they fight only for themselves. And where they fight only for themselves, we fight for we the people. All the people. And I want to get into more concrete solutions. I'm desperate to do that, and I will. I'm sure some of you are going to ask about that. But I just want to say this before we do, that none of the solutions that I get into in the book are quick or easy. And that is what a lot of people are looking for right now. The Crusaders played a long game. They spent decades capturing the highest court in the land, and that court is now just drunk with power. And we have to expect a long fight to fix the damage they have done, and to unpack, to rebalance the court. We have to shatter the myth that the courts are going to fix this for us, or that there is a silver bullet for our side. There's no quick or easy solution. Above all, the thing that we have to do is organize and message in ways that build power. Organize, that is why local groups like CFFC are so damn important. And message, that is why books like American Crusade, and that's what I'm trying to do in American Crusade. So, I'll just leave it at that. That is why you need to arm yourself. That's why you need to support groups like CFFC. And that's why you really need to read American Crusade. I'll leave it there. David, you tell me how you want to do questions. And while we're setting up, again, please, I mean, this was the 10th anniversary of CFFC. That is why I was invited. You know, we were supposed to do this because of Hurricane Ian. Obviously got postponed. To celebrate the 10th anniversary. And I have watched this organization grow. I think it's a remarkable organization. It is the model for what we are trying to do nationally, and I would encourage absolutely everybody out here to support it in every way, shape, or form they can, especially thinking about the things that Jocelyn had up on the screen beforehand. And if you don't remember, go talk to her. She's in the back. Hi. Hello.
So I'm asking Andrew about his prediction prior to the election regarding possible violence at the polls at a recent general election. My question has to do with something that my very red father-in-law said to me over Thanksgiving, which was the same idea coming from the other side. He predicts some type of civil war.
Yeah.
Have you heard this?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of talk of civil war. I mean, I think to a certain extent. So Jeff Charlotte, who wrote The Family, which became that Netflix docuseries, wrote C Street, some really fantastic investigative journalism. He essentially believes we are in a cold civil war already, and that it occasionally sparks hot, and things like the January 6th insurrection are part of that, and that you can see even some of these mass shootings are part of that. Yes, I was afraid that we would see violence in this election. I also thought that would be militated somewhat because there was nobody in power to help that violence along the way we saw last time. And it really seems clear to me that voters rejected extremism in this last election. So Americans United for Separation of Church and State, the organization I work with, AU.org, we hosted a webinar after the midterms trying to make sense of what happened for people. And this was one of the things that I talked about, which is that Christian nationalists lost pretty badly in this election cycle. A lot of them lost their primaries, and then a lot of them lost contested elections, and those that were in uncontested elections actually they underperformed pretty significantly. I mean, Doug Mastriano is probably the leading example. You know, we ended up losing, I think, the final count something like 15 points. And by and large, the last year, I think the only one so far to not accept the results of the election and concede, I believe, is still just Jerry Lane. So much different and much better than I had hoped. I'm by no means thinking we are out of the woods. I'm breathing a sigh of relief in many respects regarding the violence, but you know, I mean, the ballot's going to be different next time. It's a presidential election next time. The good news still, however, for that election is that the party and people in power at the highest levels and in control of our military are not the ones who are going to be fueling that kind of violence or insurrection. So that still to me is a very big difference. If that were to change, I don't know. So, yeah.
Thanks for that.
Sure.
So we were talking earlier about the composition of the Supreme Court and the number of people, and I'm sure in your book you get into the whole issue of adding members to the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. But the one thing that amazes me is we have a justice sitting there today who is clearly compromised, Clarence Thomas. His wife has been colluding with January 6th seditionists. And I'm just amazed that after Hillary's emails, Benghazi, now the Republicans are going to go after Hunter Biden. Why are people not agitating daily about the fact that this woman and her husband, who refuses to recuse himself from anything to do with January 6th at all, it seems to me like we should be agitating to get that guy kicked out of there and impeached. Why is it that the Democrats have no spine and no gumption to get rid of this guy?
I mean, I think there are a couple of reasons. I mean, real politics is one. I mean, just pause for a second to think about what Mitch McConnell and Leonard Leo and Donald Trump did to pack the court in the first place. Right? I already talked about the $540 million that Leo's groups spent. Think about the political capital that Mitch McConnell expended to change the size of the Supreme Court for more than 450 days when it suited him politically. Right? Knocked it down to 8, changed the size. When it was convenient, he knocked it back up to 9, put his guy on board. Right? They spent so much time and energy and political capital to make that happen. And then again, to get Amy Coney Barrett on the court after 60 million people had voted, and there was, a couple of weeks before the presidential election, which was exactly the bullshit excuse they gave for not putting Garland through a hearing to begin with. Think of all the political capital they expended to get Brett Kavanaugh on the court through credible allegations. And partner that with how ineffectual impeachment is as a check, which is something we really didn't know until recently. Right? Impeachment was always out there as a check. Our most recent example at that level was Nixon, which was pretty effective. But it's only effective when people believe in the norms.
But Nixon didn't even get impeached.
I mean, correct. The threat was enough.
Just the threat of it.
But that's my point,
Yeah.
right? And now it's not. Now we impeached Trump twice, and that was not enough to get rid of him. Even though he is a loser and a millstone around the neck of that party, they refused to turn their backs on him. So I think a big part of it is that there's no real path to making that happen. So they spent all of that time and energy and effort and money and political capital to get these people on the court. The idea that they wouldn't torpedo in every way, shape, or form any attempt to impeach them it's not realistic. I don't think getting them off the court is a way forward. I do think you can easily, or could have easily expanded the size of the US Supreme Court. And one of the things I'm trying to do with this book is to give you all the understanding of why that's necessary, the arguments to make that happen, and we need to change minds on this so that we can put political pressure on it and make it happen, because that is one of the only fixes that we have available. And every other solution out there to every other problem that we face, to every other issue that we care about, is going to go through the Supreme Court. I'm thrilled that Congress passed the Respect for Marriage Act, but if you think the Supreme Court can't get around that or gut that, you're nuts. I hope they pass the Women's Health Protection Act and find a way to codify Roe. If you don't think the Supreme Court's not going to come after that, right? Every single solution we have to every single problem, from climate change to abortion rights and reproductive freedoms, everything is going to go through one First Street. It's going to go through the Supreme Court. That is a problem that we have to solve first. So.
I was listening very carefully when you were talking about the reasons why, and one word became, that was quite important, that was the changing demographics.
Yes.
I'd like you to speak a bit about looking into the future, because those changes in demographics are not going to be reversed.
Yeah. One of the reasons I'm hopeful, right? I mean, truthfully, because the demographic trends are clear and the changes are continuing. White Christian nationalists are desperately struggling to drop the white label, and they're trying to expand their base. They're working very hard to get into Latinx churches and into Black churches to spread their message there. They're not doing it fast enough. But I mean, the demographics are, again, I mean, they're one of the reasons I have hope. And they're one of the reasons, if not the primary reason, that we are seeing this crusade in the first place. So yes, this is why I have hope, because in the end, they are going to lose. If we can keep enough people in that changing demographic trend, if we can wake enough of them up to the danger and get them angry about it, we're not going to have a problem winning in the end.
So the question is then, what are the possible, if not probable, scenarios that can result from the demographics continuing to change in this particular way? We're certainly not going to have a growing group of active American Christians or Christian zealots.
Yeah, I mean, but look, this is what, and they know this, right? This is why, remember how Leo's former colleague described his work, right? This is why they sought to, quote, stack the courts, because they knew if public opinion prevailed, they were going to lose on abortion, they were going to lose on gay rights, they were going to lose on all of these issues, because public opinion shifts with the demographics, right? They know they're going to lose these things. This is why that's why they're seeking this weapon. That's why they sought to capture the judiciary. So we have to be prepared to explain that to everybody, and then to turn that into, here's how we fix it. I mean, that really is one of the things we have to do, because they have successfully stacked the courts. I mean, Donald Trump is responsible, depending on what level of our judiciary you're looking at, for between a quarter and a third of the judges on there, and they are out there. I mean, the Supreme Court, the median in terms of ideology member of the Supreme Court right now is Brett Kavanaugh. Yeah. So it is all absolutely tied together, because it is a crusade. I encourage you to pick up a copy of the book. Hi.
Hi, thanks for coming today.
My pleasure.
My question is regarding Roe versus Wade, which you're still so pissed about.
You should be, yes.
And I know rich, white, old, conservative men don't care about babies. So what is their agenda? Do more white women have abortions, or are they trying to put women at a disadvantage? What's the reasoning?
So I have a whole chapter in the book on the Hobby Lobby case, which starts to get into this and gets into the fight about contraception. These are very, very closely intertwined, obviously, and I talk quite a bit about the motivations. I do think control of women is a big part of that, and forced conception is a big part of manifesting that control. I also have on the website, on my website, the update for the book. I have an entire breakdown of the Dobbs decision and what it did and why and how it is such a very clear violation of the separation of church and state, how it imposes one narrow religious diktat on the entire country. And you can actually see this in Alito's opinion. He writes in the opinion, he opens it in the first paragraph by talking about morality, ends in the last paragraph by talking about morality, which is code and camouflage for his personal religious beliefs. And that becomes very clear if you look at some of his other speeches and things like this. And that actually also, it became clear during oral argument in the case. So the case actually centered around, it overturned Roe versus Wade, but the law and the challenge was out of Mississippi. And it was initially I believe it was a 15-week abortion ban. And Mississippi was just trying to push the Roe viability line, just trying to change the law a little bit incrementally. And then, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and Amy Coney Barrett got put on the court, they changed their argument. They changed what they were arguing in the case and argued for fully overturning Roe versus Wade. Not because the law changed, because the personnel on the court changed, which should be a big red flag. It's a big, big giveaway, and it's something that John Roberts was frustrated about. And if you want to know why, it's not because he's a nice guy who cares about women or Roe versus Wade. Read the book. But Sonia Sotomayor asked the state of Mississippi during the oral argument, she said, how is your interest, meaning your interest in passing this law, your state's interest, anything but a religious viewpoint? And they had no answer, because it's not, all they are doing is imposing this one narrow particular vision of religion on the entire country through the law. And we never talked, well, that's not true. We talked about it like that before, but nobody listened until the court overturned Roe versus Wade. And now people are finally waking up and talking about it like this. And I will say to all of you here, the separation of church and state is the overarching issue here. It connects every other progressive issue that you care about. And fighting for that is the reason. I got into this because fighting for that makes progress on every other progressive issue that I care about, from LGBTQ rights to reproductive rights to the climate crisis. Jocelyn mentioned that I came from an environmental law background. I knew that making progress here would help me make progress and us make progress in all of those other fights. So, yeah, check out that chapter and check out the update on the book. But control of women is the short answer. Yeah. Hello.
Just have a quick softball for you. I've heard you talk about each other in winning arguments.
Yes.
The number one guest. But I've never heard you talk about kind of your origin story. We have this brilliant person fighting for us. How did you join the fight? How did you how and why did you become who you are now?
Yeah.
That's why quick.
Longest stories. I could talk about myself for hours. The short, I did not intend to go to law school. I was going to be a doctor. I majored in neuroscience. I did all my pre-med requirements. I was an EMT for a while. I worked in hospitals. I loved that work. I became a little bit disenchanted with the American medical system. Started looking for other things to do. Did Grand Canyon tours for a while. Nature photography for a while I was doing my Grand Canyon tours. Super fun. Often think that I could go back and do that and forget about the world being on fire, but it's not in me. And two things interested me in law. The first was, before I started doing those tours, I actually got called for jury duty, and I ended up being selected as the foreman on a murder trial that ended up going for 3 weeks. I ran for foreman because there was a racist jackass who ran for foreman first and said, we all know the way this is going to go, so if you let me, I'll get us out of here in a couple of hours. Meaning the defendant is black, so obviously he did it, which presented a problem for me. And I got up and said, I don't know what I said, but I ended up getting elected foreman, and by the end of it, all my fellow jurors were like, you need to go be a lawyer. And I was 22 at the time. I just graduated college, and I hadn't considered it, but so I first started thinking about it then. And then when I was doing my Grand Canyon tours, there was this couple I was giving a tour to, they were environmental attorneys. And they convinced me that I needed to go take the LSAT, go home, look it up. It's that weekend, so I went to Barnes & Noble and took a practice exam, took the LSAT the next day, and then ended up in law school, a few months later. And while I was there, I went to do the environmental fight, but I got really fascinated by this area of law. And the more I learned about it, and the more I saw how it connected to every other issue that I cared about, and that fighting, shielding our shared laws from the influence of any one religion protects our freedom and our democracy. That really convinced me that this was the place that I wanted to go. And I was at a crossroads too. I got an offer from a firm to build an environmental law practice or to go into this work at Freedom from Religion Foundation. And I opted to go the nonprofit Freedom from Religion Foundation route. We've been doing this ever since.
Hi, I just finished your books and I found you actually on the Pelogia YouTube channel.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, that was good. My question, I think I'm a little wary of any religious freedom argument after finishing your book.
Sure.
So I was seeing the news story of some religious organizations challenging the anti-abortion stuff on religious freedom grounds.
Yeah.
And that made me both happy and also wary. Like, is there any danger in making that argument?
Yeah, so a couple of those lawsuits are happening here in Florida. There are two different lawsuits here in Florida. I'm for it for a couple of reasons. I would not bring one myself. I'm supportive of certainly the goals. My fear is that when you make one of these types of religious freedom challenges to the abortion law, that those challenges, the hope is that they will riddle the abortion bans with enough holes and exemptions that it'll become essentially meaningless. My fear is that you're not going to get that, and you will get an exemption for one narrow religious group to be able to do it. So you're not really striking down the entire abortion ban and protecting rights for everyone. You're slicing off this narrow view, or narrow religion, and they are getting those rights. And then you're exacerbating a different problem in a way. It's such a crucial problem, and we face such a hostile Supreme Court that, I'm not opposed to it because it's the same sort of work that Satanic Temple does in a way, right? Like, at the very least, we're going to be showing the hypocrisy of what is happening, and highlighting the fact, too, that these abortion bans really do violate the separation of church and state by imposing one narrow religious viewpoint on all of us. So it's not the way I would structure a lawsuit, but I will certainly back them. They do make me a little nervous, though. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi. Kind of a piggyback onto that question, because I'm seeing, I'm part of the millennial generation, as they say, and even though millennials are like in their 40s now, they still treat us like we're in the backseat playing Game Boys. But I'm seeing that when it comes to youth and coming of age and voting, people are almost beaten into apathy of seeing that their vote doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And like what you just spoke on, the amount of money
Yeah.
that these crusaders have, and the advice how we can fight it. Because, like you just said, these kind of pointing out their hypocrisy isn't really working because they're blind to it.
It's not enough, certainly.
Yeah.
First of all, fellow millennials. Today was the first talk where I didn't have to do my spiel on voting, which was nice. I do, to me, the path forward for our country is pretty obvious. And we saw the impact of millennials and Gen Z in this election. It made a huge difference. You can look at the Lauren Boebert race in Colorado. Right, that race was decided by just a tiny number of votes. I have a whole thing about how people's vote counts. It is your only voice, and you have to use it. The younger generation, I think, is actually somewhat maligned. I think they do understand the importance here, and I think they're activated in a way that we've not seen. And I think a lot of it is because of what is happening now, because of the fall of Roe, because of the fact that nobody's doing anything about climate change. I do not want to be, I mentioned, you know, how we have left it to future generations to solve these horrible problems and human tragedies. I don't want to be somebody who bequeaths that to Gen Z. I want to be fighting alongside them. I love when we say, like, they give me hope, and they do, but, like, let's help them. Let's not, we can't, it's not just they give me hope and, you know, go home. It's how can we fund their work? How can we help their work? How can we amplify their voices? And I'm just so impressed, and Americans United is doing a lot on this front. We have youth fellows, so we're training up the next generation of leaders in this space. We also have a legal academy, which is something that the other side has done. If you've heard, how many people heard about Amy Coney Barrett calls for her to recuse herself from the case that's being argued tomorrow? A couple people are nodding their heads. That's because the group that is litigating this case, one of the crusaders in this book, Alliance Defending Freedom, hosts these huge fellowship programs every year where they bring all these young conservative lawyers in, or law students in, and they train them up in this ideology and then send them out into the world. They've trained something like 3,000 of these kids probably now. And Amy Coney Barrett was a paid teacher. She taught there for 5 summers. Probably alongside the lawyer who's going to argue this case tomorrow. And she's not going to recuse herself. Josh Hawley also taught there, by the way. You know, the guy who ran away. Josh Hawley has a book on masculinity coming out. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think we need to do as much as we can to empower the next generation, which is going, because it's feeding into that feedback loop that I've been talking about over and over again. We can accelerate it by doing that. Hi, speaking of.
So I just want to say, as a more of a conservative leaning person, I agree with a lot of what you had to say, like pretty much everything. You know, I think there's a huge violation of power going on in the courts, and it's just, you know, in my opinion, disgusting. But my question for you is, when you were speaking, you mentioned, you know, that it was white, you know, evangelical Christian or Christians. And I'm just kind of wondering what was the purpose of like emphasizing, you know, white people, and with that, do you think maybe omitting the race aspect of it would make allies where there would otherwise be, you know, enemies?
Certainly would. It would be less truthful. I mean, one of the things that I get into here is not just the last decade of these cases that you've seen, but also the origins of this crusade. And the origins of this crusade, and so much of what we've been actually talking about today, traces directly back to desegregation, to Brown versus Board of Education specifically. And in the wake of that decision, and in the country waking up to the realities of racial equality and that desegregation is a better way forward, racists and segregationists trying to maintain the separation of the races. Abortion, and I tell this story in the book, was not an issue. It was chosen as a political wedge issue by Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell, what would become the moral majority. They chose it as a political wedge issue because they could no longer stand on their racist, segregationist philosophy and spout that without facing some sort of political and popular backlash. They needed a new issue. And so they actually chose to make it abortion. When Roe versus Wade was decided, it landed with, for the most part, a fizzle. Other than conservative Catholics, it didn't cause that much of a stir, and a lot of the religious groups that oppose it now were in favor of it back then. And that, to me, is just a crucial piece of our history that our side does not do a good enough job talking about and explaining. Like the school vouchers fight, the movement, the push, the school choice movement traces directly back to that as well. And if you listen to them, they're all about just trying to save kids in failing inner city schools, when really their entire movement was born of keeping public schools segregated. And all of that, that's a lot, but all of that is in this book. So if that is new information for you and you're like, what? you really definitely need to go.
So we live in Florida, and extremism may have been rejected everywhere in the country last month, but not in Florida. So what do you think we can do about our governor, who seems to be quite powerful and has international aspirations?
Yeah, I mean, what do you want to do about it?
It's legal to be where he is.
I know.
It didn't work. It didn't work
Yeah.
last month by, I don't know if I believe the numbers, but anyway, he was reelected with a huge number.
Yeah.
And he's pretty extreme, so.
He is. I mean, I don't have an answer to, if I had an answer to how do we win, this election or that election, I would not be a kind of nonprofit. I'd be in a different income bracket too. I do think there are a lot of things that can be done and a lot of solutions to the problems that we face. But for me, the number one thing that we have to do is, and I thought about this, and I talked about this at the Americans United debrief of the election, is you fix the court, and then you need small d democratic reform across the board. And that means expanding the franchise, protecting the franchise, ending racial gerrymandering, ending political gerrymandering. This election, the House changed hands, and we're all breathing a sigh of relief that it wasn't that bad. But if you look at the court decisions from the Supreme Court that reinstituted racially gerrymandered maps in a number of different states, including Alabama, and then using that decision, Texas, South Carolina, Louisiana. I mean, if you look at what happened in New York, where the conservative Supreme Court there essentially appointed a special master to create a conservative gerrymander in that court, again, in that state against the will of the legislature, you're talking between probably 15 and 20 House seats that were shifted to the Republicans because of those decisions and because of that gerrymander, which is a very different outcome in the election. So the things that I think we need to do are obvious and have to be the top priorities. It is fixing the Supreme Court and then small d and democratic reform. And if you look back to 2020, when Democrats first took office, they proposed H.R. 1, We the People, the John Lewis vote. That is the kind of stuff that we need to get done. And it all fizzled, or for the most part, it all fizzled. And I think that was a big mistake. And one of I did not write about this in American Crusade, but one of the other through lines and one of the other holy grails for John Roberts is destroying the Voting Rights Act. And that is going to happen this term. I mean, it's already mostly happened, but that's going to be gone back into this.
So any suggestions for Floridians specifically?
I'm gonna have to leave it. I'm gonna have to leave it too generally. I'm not gonna wade into yeah.
Pretty bad.
Yeah. I mean, I've worked with David and Jocelyn for a long time in Florida, so I'm not terribly unfamiliar with it.
Can't tell.
Hi. Could you talk about how the lower courts enter into this whole crusade plan?
Yeah, good question. Talk about the lower courts. They are absolutely a part of it. There's, and I talked about this in some of the updates too, there's a little bit in here. They provide a pipeline for a lot of these decisions, helping the crusader groups along the way. There are a couple of courts in Texas where you know that you're going to get one of two conservative judges who are completely aligned with the Crusaders. They know their names. One of them actually worked for one of the groups, First Liberty Institute, in here before he was put on the federal bench, a judge named Matthew Kaczmarek. And we know what's going to happen. And then that's a pipeline that goes from that district court through the Fifth Circuit, which is probably more conservative than our Supreme Court, and then to the Supreme Court. And that's how you get decisions like, that's how you get what happened with SB 8 in Texas, right? With the mob rule over the womb that happened before Roe versus Wade was overturned. Again, Trump, depending on what level of our lower courts you're looking at, appointed between a quarter and a third of the judges. For my money, I've talked about expanding the Supreme Court pretty extensively here. For my money, if you gave me supreme judicial power tomorrow, well, what I would do. I would expand the entire size of the federal judiciary, top to bottom, and then add one extra on the Supreme Court. That's what I would do. And we need that. We need that just administratively. Our courts are so overwhelmed and overworked right now. We are at the point where justice delayed is justice denied. We're well past that.
Thanks again for coming. I'm going to circle back at the beginning when you talked about Cold War, Civil War. In my view, it seems like it's pretty much one-sided, the violence.
Yeah.
What's going to happen? What do you think is going to push it where
Well,
the other side decides to take up arms?
I mean, I don't know that that's going to happen. That's part of what I'm talking about, where the backstop for me, where I am up all night most nights anyway, but the backstop for me that's not really keeping me up or giving me some solace is the fact that the crazy people are not in power and don't have power right now. The people who are espousing violence or engaging in stochastic terrorism, riling up the mobs, don't have that kind of power. They don't have the power over the military, or even the power to not call out the military, which is one of the things that happened on January 6th. So I breathe and I sleep a little easier at night knowing that. And if things go the other way, I don't know that I will have. I don't know what will give me solace, and I don't know what will happen, because that's at least a couple years down the road.
All right, this is the last question. You were asking, you mentioned climate change, and at no point, I think, have you really connected how state-church separation and climate change is connected.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting, and so that's the last question.
So there are a couple of different, I think I will share a story briefly about that, which is illustrative, rather than going into all of the various details. Representative John Shimkus of Illinois, who was chair of one of the House Science Committees, chair of one of the House Science Committees, said, this was 2014, 2013, we do not have to worry about human-generated climate change. Because God promised Noah never flood the earth again. This is the person who's in charge of the science, right? I don't think shielding our shared laws from the influence of religious beliefs like that is vitally important to progress on so many of the other issues that we care about. And there are actually a number of other ways that this connects. I mean, if you look at the demographics of who believes in climate change and thinks it needs a fix versus who does not, white evangelical Christians are far and away the outlier group there. There are, I'll leave it there. I could go on that one, but there are, and I've actually written about this a couple times. I haven't written about it while I've been at AU, but while I was at Freedom from Religion Foundation, I wrote a couple things about how climate change is a state church issue. So if you go Google my name in that, more will definitely pop up.
Thank you. We very much appreciate you coming today. If everyone